In this video, I'm going to show you two different ways to build wall cabinets. The first way with more basic construction that's good and sturdy for use in your shop, and the other way more traditional like what you would see in a kitchen or pantry. I'll go over how to build the carcass as well as the face frame and show you how to build frame and panel doors using a table saw. Now there is a lot of information to cover, so let's get going. Alright, to do the two different versions of these cabinets, I need some 3/4 inch plywood for the carcasses, some 1/2 inch plywood for the door panels and backs, and some 1/4 inch plywood for the backs of the traditional style cabinets. The first thing I need to do is break this plywood down into manageable chunks. And if you've watched my previous videos, you know I love doing this with one of these centipede work holders with a piece of foam insulation on top. It's quick to set up and lets me cut at a comfortable height and not on the floor. To break this down, you'll need a circular saw and a straight edge at a minimum, but I like to use my track saw because it creates a lot less dust in the shop, which is important to me. After I have all my blanks cut, I can move to the table saw to cut all my parts to final size. And the first thing I like to do here is to cut off the ragged factory edges, which is just going to make everything clean and crisp on all sides. Now, compared to base cabinets, the wall cabinet parts are pretty straightforward and much smaller. I'm going to be making two 30-inch cabinets and two 18-inch cabinets, and then I'm going to combine each 30-inch cabinet to an 18-inch cabinet to make two 48-inch units. And I'll show you how that happens later in the video. And just like that, I have all the parts cut to make my cabinets. Okay, first up, I'm going to show you the more basic form of construction, which uses pocket screws. But you'll notice I'm not using my normal pocket hole jig. So this is a Castle pocket cutting machine, and it's really changing the way that I make pocket holes. This machine uses a set of routers to cut the pocket as well as the pilot hole for the screw, all in one easy motion. You can see here when I push back on the lever, one router bit swings up, cutting the pocket, and when I pull the lever forward, another bit drills the pilot hole. The result is a very clean pocket with no debris left inside. And the ease of use makes this machine very quick at cutting lots of pockets in my cabinet parts. Next, I need to cut a rabbet along the back edge of each side, which is going to end up housing the back panel of the cabinet. To do this, I'm just using a regular table saw blade and taking multiple passes until I can fit my back panel in place nice and flush. Another thing I'm going to do here is to mark which edge is the bottom of the cabinet, and this is just going to allow me to keep everything oriented correctly so that when I put it together, all my sides are facing the correct way. Now with this simple spacer block that I made out of plywood, I'm going to go ahead and use my shelf pin jig to drill out all my shelf pin holes. I very much recommend doing this step now before assembly because it's much easier to drill accurate hole locations. As I mentioned, assembling this version of the cabinet is going to be pretty basic. I'm lining up the bottom panel flush with the sides and clamping it into place before I drive my pocket screws home. I then repeat that same process with the top panel, just making sure that I assemble the cabinet face down so that the rabbets that I cut in the sides are exposed. I quickly double check everything for square before I add glue to the rabbets and slide the 1/2 inch back panel in place. I'm going to go ahead and countersink and screw the back panel into place for added strength and then clamp the sides so that the rabbet joints are nice and tight. And I see that I have a little glue squeeze out along that back corner, which I'm just going to clean out with a straw. Okay, next I'm going to show you the more traditional construction method, and this begins with making some rough reference lines because I need to cut a bunch of dados and I need to make sure that I keep them straight so that when my two sides are up, they mirror one another when I'm done. First, I'm going to use the back nailer to set the distance to the fence on my table saw and cut a 1/4 inch groove along the back of each side piece, which is going to house the back panel. But before I move the fence to take my second pass, I also begin cutting the dados along the top and bottom because they're going to be the same distance from the edge as that groove on the back. I go ahead and do that whole thing with the other side as well. I can then tap my fence outwards to sneak up on my 1/4 inch mark for the back groove, and I just keep nibbling away until the back panel fits nicely into the groove like this. I then repeat the process with the dados on the top and bottom, continuing to tap the fence outwards after each pass. I've got to keep doing this until the dados are wide enough to fit the top and bottom panels. Now,
If you happen to have a router table, this process can go a bit quicker. I still use the back nailer to set the distance to the fence and then use a special undersized plywood bit to cut the groove in the back. I then use another undersized 3/4 inch plywood bit to cut the top and bottom dados. These undersized plywood bits are made specifically to make sure that your dados are nice and tight around plywood, since plywood is never actually 1/4 inch or 3/4 inches thick. If you want to check those router bits out for yourself, I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description. Now, one of the biggest things that makes the traditional style of building these cabinets different than the basic style is that the top and bottom panels sit in dados that are offset by 3/4 of an inch from the top and bottom of the cabinet. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is that it creates this lip around the top of the cabinet that you can use to attach trim, and it also creates a recess on the bottom of the cabinets if you're thinking about adding lighting, say, under the cabinets and over your countertops. Next, I go ahead and slide the back panel into the groove, making sure that it's flush with the ends. And then I add 2 nailers in place and fasten them with pocket screws. Now, off camera, I went ahead and built the 18-inch cabinets the exact same way, and now I want to combine the 30-inch and the 18-inch together to make one 48-inch unit. After lining up the edges and clamping them together, I go ahead and add screws above and below the top and bottom panels so that they're not going to be seen inside the cabinet. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and double check the dimensions of the carcass here now that it's all together, because I'm about to make the face frame. Oh, and I also forgot I need to go ahead and fasten the back panel to the nailers using brad nails. Now, for the simpler pocket screw cabinets, I don't really have a way to hide these screws from sight, so I'm just going to go ahead and go right into the inside of the cabinet. But hey, that's okay, these are shop cabinets anyway. Did I just rhyme that? Alright, with the carcasses fastened together, I can go ahead and make a face frame for each one. To start this process, I cut up some pre-surfaced hard maple lumber at the chop saw. I like using pre-surfaced lumber here because it doesn't require any milling machines like joiners and planers to get this job done. I can just cut it and begin building. After chopping out the blanks, I go ahead and head over to the table saw to rip my parts to width. And after that, I cut everything to final length using a crosscut sled by ganging my parts together. I'm going to be assembling these frames with pocket screws, so I go ahead and clamp a guide to the table of the pocket cutting machine, which is going to allow me to use that edge as a reference so that I can batch out these parts quickly. Now, besides making super clean pockets, the other advantage to this pocket cutting machine is the angle of the screw is much shallower than the typical 15 degrees of a drill pocket jig. Now, that matters because these screws are going in almost parallel to the work, which virtually eliminates the dreaded pocket hole creep that can happen whenever your workpiece moves as you drive that pocket screw into place. You can see here that I'm just using my thumb as a clamp, which I would never attempt using a 15-degree pocket hole jig. Soon enough, I have this face frame together, and I give the whole thing a sanding to 180 grit to make sure that all those joints are nice and flush. Now, since my cabinets are not going to be painted, I'm just going to go ahead and glue the face frame to the carcass and fasten it with clamps. Lots and lots of clamps. If I were painting these, I would go ahead and use brad nails here instead of clamps and just fill in the holes before painting it to avoid needing all these clamps. Okay, next come the doors, and I'm going to be using the same pre-surfaced maple to make the frame parts. Now, if you're making these cabinets for your shop, you can probably just use 3/4 inch plywood panels for the doors, but I didn't want to waste time showing you how to cut a rectangle out of plywood and fastening it to the cabinet, so instead, what I'm going to do is show you how to build frame and panel doors, which are simple to make on a table saw and are going to look much better if your cabinets are going to be used in an application like a kitchen or pantry. All these frame parts are 2 inches wide, so I'm just going to set my fence once to 2 inches and start cutting. You may decide that 2 inches isn't the right dimensions for your cabinets. I've built a lot of frame and panel doors, and I think 2 inches looks really nice for the frame. Now, I did end up cutting the longer styles using my miter saw, but to do this on the table saw, I just need to install my crosscut saw blade and break out my crosscut sled again to cut the parts to length. The crosscut sled is my preferred way to make super accurate crosscuts, and I think it's a little safer too, especially when you get to those smaller rail parts that are going to be a little more dangerous to cut at the miter saw. Now once that's done, I go ahead and put the ripping blade back in the table saw because I'm going to be cutting grooves in all my frame parts. These grooves are going to house the center panel in the finished door. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and use a single blade here to make a pass and then flip the piece end for end to make another pass, which is going to create a perfectly centered groove in my part. Next, I need to cut tongues in all the top and bottom rails. Normally, I like to use my tenon jig for this, but I decided to show you another way to do it. Now, I went ahead and installed my dado stack to make quicker work of these cuts, and laying a test workpiece down flat on the table saw, I go ahead and make some cuts until I sneak up on the fit that I want. Then I can take my real top and bottom rail parts and begin making the tongues and the ends of each. Okay, next I need to cut some 1/2-inch ply to make the center panels. Pretty simple here, I just go ahead and set my dado stack back up to make a rabbet around all 4 edges of each panel. I'm using a sacrificial fence here to bury the dado stack in so that only 1/2 inch is exposed. Now with the dado stack, unlike a single blade, this process goes by real quick and it's on to assembly. To start, I add glue to the tongues on each end of the top and bottom rails and slide them into the groove in the side, or sometimes it's called a stile. I then slide the center panel into place, making sure that it sits in the groove all the way around before adding the other stile. I give the ends a little tap to make sure that everything is nice and flush, and then I add the clamps. Just 2 clamps are needed here, one spanning each joint. And once I have all my drawers done, I set those aside overnight to dry. After removing the doors from the clamps, I go ahead and trim the top and bottom joints just so that everything is nice and flush and that each door is the exact same length before I go on to using my door hinge jig to create pockets for my European style hidden hinges. Now to install these, I go ahead and lay a scrap of plywood down to create the reveal that I want at the bottom of the cabinet, and I attach the hinges to the face frame, first pre-drilling and then screwing the doors into place. And after making some small adjustments to the hinges, these doors sat perfect and even. I could then use this handy door hardware jig to drill the holes for the door pulls. And that's that for the doors. The last thing I need to do here is add shelves, but before I went ahead and installed those, I wanted to add edge banding to the front edge. Now because these are shop cabinets, I'm using iron-on edge banding, which I like because of its simplicity. Just using an iron activates the glue and sticks the edge banding to the shelf. I then use a roller to ensure a nice firm bond and set that shelf aside to cool while I do the next shelf. Next I trim the edges flush and then trim the side waist using this double-edged trimmer and then just quickly sand the rough edges smooth. And these shelves just snap into place using these plastic shelf clips that fit into the shelf pin holes and hold these shelves securely in place. And that's it. 2 sets of wall cabinets done with 2 different construction methods.
Now, if you have any comments or questions, please leave those down below. Anything that I may not have covered in the video, I'd be happy to answer those for you. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. That would help me out a lot. And also make sure that you hit the bell icon to be notified every time I release a new video. Speaking of videos, here's a couple other ones that I think you guys are really going to enjoy, so check those out. And until next time, have fun in the shop.